Summer 1924. Though he had no Miss Baxter to spy for him, Thomas had managed to acquire gossip from the unlikeliest of places, none more so than Jack Prue, who had expanded his business venture from whiskey into horses. Two now were in the yard at the back of Milo's house, and when Prue had asked Thomas to come down, in effect to approve of his venture, Thomas couldn't help admitting that Prue was a natural when it came to the beasts. "I heard that young lady, Rose, has been seen in the company of a black-skinned musician," he told Thomas. "That would bring shame to the family, would it not?" "It might," Thomas admitted. It had been a shock to find out he was such a manipulator, how people saw him, and he had decided to do something about it, the first being to hold his tongue when he felt like sharing nasty comments, and in fact, only passing positive ones on to those around him. At first, Thomas felt the powerlessness he used to feel when he was in his father's company, whose words became the narrative of the household, whether or not they bore any resemblance to the truth of anything. That was when it had started, Thomas thought, and how he had learned that being nasty and cruel gave him power and choices. But, over the few weeks he had begun this experiment, Thomas had been surprised in a number of ways, namely, that the gossip he sought, which equated to power through choices and advanced warning, came to him anyway, through people in general who were too eager to pass it on without a thought or, like Prue, unagreed confiding. This was much more like it, the information capsule he needed without the effort. No, more than that, without the hostility that came with it. "They do as they please, make mistakes as they please," Thomas told him. "They have the luxury of money to bail them out when things go wrong. What happens to us, Mr. Prue? One slip, and it's debtor's jail, loss of income, loss of home, with no safety net." The man looked across from the dappled grey mare. "You talk of the Marconi money, perhaps," Thomas told him. And while he was pleased to share prudent financial advice, he was far less likely to take his own advice for, despite Cousin Freddie's warning, Thomas had been using the money. A payment here, a few shillings there. What could they do? Milo owned this house. The law could not take that from her for his debt. "I miss her," Thomas admitted. "Sometimes, I wish she were here, managing her own electrical appliance business. She was marvelous at that, and a good saleswoman." And he missed Ernest. For the first time in a long time, after admitting his love of him to Mr. Bates, Thomas could think about his first and only true love without anger and sorrow and grief consuming him. "What have you for yourself, Thomas?" Prue asked him. "Do you paint? Do you fish? Do you collect things?" No, Thomas thought. He had learned if he gave his heart to a hobby people could take it off you. In a sense, he collected skills. He learned things, like repair sewing, and laundry care and soldering. Things that might be needed in a big house. Things which could be called upon at a time of crisis. Things no one could take away. "Not really. I do like to read," he admitted. "Though, that letter. Branson's letter ... I wonder how ever you manage it, as well as English." Prue looked at him, and shrugged. "I learned it at my mother's knee. We all did. But it was taken from us, just as many oppressors take languages away. Denying a person their own name, and their language and their way of life does indeed work against a conquered people." But, Prue struck a match and lit his pipe, before offering a cigarette to Thomas, who took one. In doing so, a nugget of rebellion is always planted, and can never be extinguished. "You think Ireland was conquered?" Thomas asked. "Oh, absolutely," Prue replied. "As Britain has done many times over. How could such a small island capture so much of the world otherwise?" And Thomas could see that. "Now, will it be better, now?" Thomas asked. "Now you have what you want?" Prue shook his head. "The Civil War has abated, to be sure," Prue told him. "And we were a united island for, well, about a day." Michael Collins, de Valera ... They all agreed in self-determination, and that each county would vote for itself. "Well," he puffed on his pipe, "you cannot have your cake and eat it, as they say. 6 counties of the 9 in Ulster immediately seceded to Britain. Unless they had considered genocide of their own people, there was nothing to stop that." Thomas nodded. not really understanding. But in his new enlightened way, he had found that letting people talk was almost as effective in garnering information capital as was cold, hard, nasty manipulation. But there was one thing in Prue's words. Abated? Yes, nodded Prue, sadly, as the pieball stamped at the cobbles. Idly, he leaned over to caress its mane. The Civil War will continue forever now. Some have accepted this. Partition was the worst outcome. If only they had waited, we could have held out for better. Now, there can only be irrevocable stalemate for generations to come. Then I hope for the best for you, Mr. Prue, when you eventually return. And your country. Too much? Too sugary? Thomas was still practicing. He smiled, saying no more, standing by his words. Mr. Barrow, that is the best I have ever heard an Englishman say, he told him, holding out a hand. Now, let us think how it is we can get dear Melusina to return of her own volition. Before I leave. He broke off, and nodded his acknowledgement of Thomas's not groundless hypothesis. I would like the reputation of that sonny traitor, who dared to do that to her, destroyed forever. And Thomas explained, then, how it was that, through Bates, they had themselves a third ally. 88,888,888 Ogodo. Rose McClare exclaimed, when the large machine was being assembled on a large table at the foot of the stairs in the hall of Downton Abbey. Doubts were cast upon it, but Thomas and Lady Rose exchanged a look, both thinking of Milo. Then, as the chairs were being arranged in an arc, so the family could listen to the King's broadcast about the great exhibition, she called him over, and continued to walk into the small library, pulling out of her pocket the little radio transmitter Milo gave her. She held it out to Thomas, who nodded. Very good, he told her, but Lady Rose held out her hand even further. Look, see, she told him. You can try it if you like. But Thomas shook his head. I know Milo must be responsible for this, he told her. But I do not know how it works. Lady Rose shook her head, and then walked to the wall, flicking on the light switch. Here, she told him, and offered it to Thomas, and then, hold it by the light. Which he did, and could not conceal a smile when the tiny device vibrated in his hand. My word, Thomas told Rose, and then held it back out to her. Milo gave me one like it too. Then, you do know what it does, Rose told him, delightedly. But Thomas shook his head. My brother is a clockmaker. I gave it to him, in the hope he could adapt a timepiece with it, try a new design. Rose gave him another smile. Then, I think you are absolutely marvelous, Barrow, she told him, as the door opened. To have given away something so precious. I might not have done, had I known what it did, he said, confidingly. My brother is trying a new method of making clocks operate using it. I am determined that it could be used in clocks, though an electrical circuit is needed. The accuracy would be amazing. He nodded to Rose, and added, if Milo was not away at Cambridge, the development of electrical clocks would be something she would develop, I am sure. She would work at Downton. She has her father's house, and his workshop, but she doesn't use it while she is away. Thomas shook his head, and was about to qualify that with an explanation, but she spoke over him and he fell silent. Then, Rose was about to say more, but Carson was holding the door open. He gave Thomas a Gorgon-like stare, and Thomas wondered whether he was about to be turned to stone. And they listened to the broadcast, and stood at the national anthem. And all the while, in Rose's hand the little receiver was buzzing as the King spoke to them. Can we keep the radio, just for a small time? Rose asked Lord Grantham, and dazzled the room with her smile when Robert Crawley agreed. 88,888,888. So it was that conversation with Thomas Barrow that Rose remembered when she made her way back from the crypt of the church on Ripon, having served at the soup kitchen there. The rector had passed a comment to Lady Constance about a lack of space in the rooms that had been allocated to them, and her head was filled with the face of the man who she had met that day, Atticus Aldridge. So Rose was in a buoyant mood, and, as she got the station to return to Downton, a thought struck her. Mr. Barrow, Lady Rose called, as she got to the back kitchen door. having crossed the yard in the dusk light and letting herself into the kitchen. Hurriedly, servants stood and waited for her to give orders. But Rose shook her head. Finally, to Carson's displeasure, he closed the door to his parlour on Thomas and Lady Rose, who was sparkling with adrenaline as the idea filled her mind until there was no other possibility in the world. "Mr. Barrow," she enthused, "I have had simply the most wonderful idea." And she told him about the refugees, and figured, with the nominal sum the government were offering to take them in. "So, what about it?" she asked. But Thomas was about to let her down. "No," he told her firmly, and Rose McClare's face fell. "No, but she was interrupted in the words she was going to plead with a hasty knock on the door. It was Carson. "If you have quite finished, Barrow?" he asked, "because you are needed for the entrees." "Oh, dinner has begun?" Lady Rose asked. "Yes, my lady," he told her. Rose looked across to Thomas. "I will come back to speak to you another time," she told Thomas. "Very good, my lady," Thomas told her. "But the answer will be the same." Number 88,888,888. "What a horrid man," declared Lady Rose. At dinner she had reached into her pocket and brought out the radio receiver, and held it in her hand under the table. "That horrid man rescued a young woman, too, if you mean Edith," Mrs. Crawley told her, kindly. "And it is me Lucina's property, not Mr. Barrow's, legally," she added. "I should know. My son drew up the contract." "And doesn't he have Mrs. Jameson's butler living there now?" Lady Grantham told him. "It was kind of Barrow to let him stay there, when the Jamesons went to live with their cousins." Thomas looked on, thinking about the bizarre situation, whereby he had just been called horrid, had been supported, and had Prue's residency discussed while he was standing there. It was no wonder so many people were leaving service after a taste of manufacturing or bookkeeping. But it was Phyllis Baxter who went to see Mrs. Crawley at Crawley House the next morning, rather than Lady Rose, for she was concerned about Thomas, who had stood out in the kitchen yard so long last night, even as the rain poured down, and then had gone missing for most of the night, appearing in the morning walking over the fields from the generator room. There was something more to it all than simply a marriage of convenience between Thomas and Miss Ashby. "Do you know what might have made him act in such a way?" Miss Baxter asked. I know I am not in the least entitled to know, but I do care for Thomas's welfare, Mrs. Crawley. Believe it or not, I have known him nearly all his life, though from how he behaves, no one would know it. Isabel Crawley smiled, and patted Phyllis Baxter on the arm. "I can only guess that it must be guilt," she told Baxter. "You know, of course, that Milo and Thomas are married?" "Yes," Miss Baxter told her. "An unusual marriage," Mrs. Crawley told her. "But it is as clear to me as the sun in the sky that they care for one another, which is why I agreed to be a witness to their marriage, as did Matthew, my son." Phyllis Baxter waited, saying nothing. "Something brought her to Downton nearly 2 years ago, and Milo got herself into a bit of trouble and she ended up falling from the roof of the church, trying to dismantle her radio transmitter. She had been conducting experiments with it, and another at Downton Abbey, for many years, and with Lord Grantham's consent. The fall made her miscarry. She lost a child, whether she knew it or not, and..." Mrs. Crawley paused, then fixed Miss Baxter with a long look. "Her ladyship had cause to mention that you were in an unfortunate position once in your life, Miss Baxter?" Phyllis Baxter nodded. "Then, on your life you will not repeat what I am about to tell you." "I swear, Mrs. Crawley," Miss Baxter told her immediately. "Then here it is. Me Lucina was brought here to recover Dr. Clarkson, and I realized that some of the bleeding was unnatural. While Miss Ashby was recovering, she confided in me that the child lost had not been brought about consensually." The gravity of Mrs. Crawley's words shocked Phyllis Baxter, and she raised a hand to her mouth in horror. "And it couldn't have been Thomas?" Mrs. Crawley stared at her. "I mean I don't mean about consent." She trailed off, and then looked to the floor. "No, it couldn't," Miss Baxter reflected, and then she looked back to Isabel Crawley. "And this girl, utterly brilliant," Mrs. Crawley enthused, her demeanor changing quickly. "And, as long as we are under the same promise as earlier, Miss Baxter." Phyllis Baxter nodded. Thomas Barrow was in love with her brother, which of course anyone could tell, and when he died did what was in his power to protect her. She smiled to the lady's maid. "It is good he has a friend like you," she told her. "Because once a sneak, always a sneak," Phyllis Baxter reckoned, and she had read some of Miss Ashby's letters to Thomas, telling him about an opportunity to go away, and from her phrasing willing Thomas to understand. "I do know, and I will tell you, as you are his friend. Lucina has the opportunity to go to Europe, to work with physicists in Denmark, in France, Belgium, Germany. She wrote to me, telling me, and I wrote back about how delighted I was. But Miss Baxter knew Thomas was not happy about it, and said so." "Whatever not?" Mrs. Crawley wondered. "I think it has something to do with a young man," Phyllis Baxter suggested. But, from what she had read, Milo Ashby was very taken with the man she had referred to as HB. "She is only 20 years of age, so if she is, it is the first burst of love," Mrs. Crawley remarked. "You are younger than me, you remember. Do you not, Miss Baxter?" "I do indeed," Phyllis Baxter replied. "And that man caused me to steal from my employer, for which I went to jail." "Then I thank you for telling me," Mrs. Crawley told her. But things were going to get worse for Thomas Barrow, as Phyllis Baxter was about to find out. For Thomas had received rather a brief letter from Milo, unexpectedly. Daisy was the cause of it, from what he could make out, and he remembered suggesting she write to Milo. But what had she written? It must have been something very thoughtless for Milo to write so forcefully to him, and that was the beginning. Thomas had already seen the advertisement for the electrical therapy, conversion therapy. He had already been to York to find out more. It would help him get over his urges, the man insisted. He had high success rates. But it wasn't just that, Thomas reflected, carrying a case of medication and syringe with which to inject himself with the medicine that would cure him. The man had shown him how, avoiding a very chipper, well-employed estate manager, son-in-law of Lord Grantham, who was driving one of the Downton cars. Thomas might well have struck him if he bumped into him. Tom Branson. "No," was the coldness of her words that caused Thomas to decide that he must act. "Thomas, I think after all of this, we need to begin to live our own lives now.